All right. Thanks a lot for the kind introduction. Thanks a lot to everyone for coming. So today I'm going to talk about understanding and articulating articulated objects. I'll try to keep it brief so that you can all get to lunch. So articulated objects are all around us, right? Be it simple objects, everyday objects like cupboards and drawers, ovens, what you have. These are simple 1 degree of freedom parts, which are, are found in varied scene geometries. To more, and they can have different kind of joints. You can have a prismatic joint, you can have a revolute joint, and so forth. We also have more complex objects. So here's a printer at my home. It's not just 1 degree of, it's not just one part, but there's a composition of many, many parts, right? So this part can come out, this part can rotate, but not just that it has many parts, but these are parts which are arranged in a hierarchy, right? So I can have this extension which can come out and so forth, right? And going further, we actually have other kinds of articulated objects. And in this case, it's not even a fully rigid articulation, but it's also not completely free from articulation. So I'm talking about these plants that you're seeing on the very right-hand side. If you consider each leaf, there is some axis along which it can actually rotate. It can be moved quite a bit, but there are other axes along which it can actually not move very much. So in this talk today, what I'll try to show some work which tackles some problems in this context. In the first piece, I'll talk about how can we articulate 1 degree of freedom objects in varied scene geometries. Then I'll talk about how can we infer articulable models for complex articulated objects, which have like this kind of a tree structure. And finally, I'll try to give a teaser about how can we manipulate articulated objects with complex dynamics. Okay, so let's get started. So this first piece is, this is actually a paper at ICRA 2023, work led by Saurabh Gupta, who's my student in my lab. And the task we were interested in over here was to articulate these everyday objects, right? So these single 1 degree of freedom kind of things, right? And this problem is interesting because when you start doing motion planning with these things, if you're not quite accurate, if the robot is off, if you end up outputting a motion trajectory which doesn't exactly articulate the object as it should, you will experience large amount of forces, and either the drawer will break or the robot will break, right? And we don't want either of those things to happen. So in this work, we were designing an approach which can output precise motion plans which can articulate these objects, right? So that's kind of the problem we are interested in. So the classical approach to solve this problem would be as follows. At test time, I'll be given some sensory observation. I'll have, let's say, a vision system, maybe like one that some version of what Georgie has described, which let's say can estimate the articulation geometry, and it gives me waypoints that I want to follow, right? But I still need to translate these waypoints into end effector, into joint angles that the robot should be at, such that it can actually successfully achieve these waypoints while also continuously moving the arm along these waypoints, right? And you can do that. You can do that with motion planners, and you can output motion plans which will actually do this job for you. But this is not a trivial motion planning problem. This is a constrained motion planning problem, because you want the end effector to follow the specific constraint that you have to follow, right? And so if this classical approach suffers from two limitations. One, it has high sensing cost, because to be able to actually output motion plans, you also need to reason about scene geometry and what will collide with what and so forth as you articulate the object. And the motion planning problem is also not so easy because of this extra constraints that you have to deal with. So in this work, the key insight that we have is that we will leverage past experience of solving similar problems in order to speed up this process at inference time. Right. So instead of working in isolation on one instance that I have to solve, I'm going to try to, at training time, try to solve a lot of motion planning problems and compile my solutions into some canonical motion plans that I can now quickly use at test time. Right. So at training time, I'll have a data set of inputs, scans and so forth with full information. I'll spend the motion planning time to actually generate solutions. I'll get a data set of motion plans. And then I'll train a machine learning model which can actually output these motion plans. And there's a detail that I'll get into. We don't directly output the motion plans. We are going to output a representation for a motion plan, which will then decode into a motion plan that we'll actually execute on. Right? So this is what we are going to do. And at inference time, it's simple. We will essentially use the machine learning model to output this representation for the motion plan, and then we'll decode it into a motion plan, right? Okay, so that's kind of what we're doing. So there are three parts to getting this to work. The first is we need to, build this data set. The second is we need to develop this motion plan representation, which we can efficiently decode. And the third is we need to develop this machine learning model. Right? Okay, good. So we are building this simulator on top of this HM3D effort from Facebook, which is a large number of, it's a collection of indoor scans, but these don't have any articulated objects. What we have done is you take these 3D scans, but then you add some lightweight annotation on top to start simulating simple kinematic objects, right? So you have this image of a kitchen. You can mark out, okay, this is the face of the cupboard. There's the handle, and because you have the underlying scene geometry associated with this image available in these scans, you can actually start simulating. You can lift these annotations to 3D, and you can start simulating, that this cupboard is opening and so forth, right? Now this is essentially articulation geometry for an object which is placed in an actual scene, not in isolation in SharpNet. Plus, you get real appearance to work with, right? So it's not synthetic; it's actually real pixels that we can train models on, right? Okay, so that's our data set. Now, the second thing, so we have done, I think these are 100 scenes that we have annotated these objects in. We have about 4,000 articulated objects, including basically 4 types of joints. So prismatic, 2 types of joints, prismatic and hinge joints, but hinge joints can be in different things, like you can be opening an oven or you can be opening a cupboard and so forth, right? Okay, so this is the data set. Now, let me tell you about our representation for motion plans. And this is actually built upon inverse kinematics that some of you may be familiar with, where essentially inverse kinematics is a process that I have some end effector pose, and I'm trying to figure out the joint angles that my robot should be at, such that the end effector is at the pose that I want it to be at, right? And this process is, you can solve this using inverse kinematics. And what we are doing is to solve a sequence of inverse kinematics problems one after another, right? So you take the first waypoint, you get the joint angles. You take the second waypoint, get the joint angles, and so forth. And now note that we are not solving these inverse kinematics problems independently, but we are going to solve them. We're going to warm start the inverse kinematics for the second waypoint from the solution of the inverse kinematics for the first waypoint, right? And just in case you don't know about inverse kinematics, it is basically, you can think of it as gradient-based optimization to output joint angles that will lead the end effector to a desired pose, right? Okay, and because we are synchronizing them by warm starting from one to the other, you can actually interpolate in the joint angle space, and that doesn't cause the end effector to deviate too much. It still follows the trajectory that you would like to follow. If you're familiar with trajectory optimization in robotics literature, you can actually view this process as simplified trajectory optimization, where we are not doing any collision checking. We are not, we're just solving this one optimization problem, right? Okay. Good. So this is a motion plan, and it turns out this actually works quite well. This is a trajectory that you can find with this kind of with sequential inverse kinematics. And note the deviations; they're very low, so it's very precise trajectories, and we can do this fast. This is just optimizing this trajectory takes less than a second, much less than a second. This is unoptimized implementations and whatnot. We compared it with existing motion planning libraries. So you can do unconstrained motion planning, and that will obviously do the wrong thing. The end effector will fly between different poses because they're not accurate. You can do constrained motion planning, which is a whole subfield in motion planning. At least the public implementations we tried, even after giving 15 minutes, it would find trajectories which kind of make sense, but are not exactly accurate. Right? Whereas we can actually get trajectories very fast, very quickly, very good, very fast. Now, this all still has this problem that I need to figure out the right theta zero, right? So there is still an initialization that is involved, and getting the initialization right is important. If you don't, if you change theta naught, you'll get a different motion plan, and that might intersect with the environment, or it might actually not be able to fulfill the task and such. So this theta naught has to be, you have to be intelligent about picking the right theta naught. And so instead of searching for motion plans, we are now instead going to search for theta zeros, which is the initialization for my inverse kinematics process. And that's kind of where we bring in learning, which is that you have an image, you have a target object that you want to articulate. We train a neural network, which is going to output good initializations for articulating this specific object. And this is done using our simulator in this case, where we, ahead of time, just try all theta zeros. We figure out what are good initializations for the robot arm and, where the base is and so forth, and try them all out. And here's a heat map. You can think of if theta zero comprises of, base locations and so forth. For each location, you can compute whether this worked out or not for this particular instance. And then you can train this network using supervised learning. To do inference, you do this process, you do some internal collision checking based on the geometry that's available only from your onboard camera. You don't need a full scan. So you can do this kind of internal checking. So you get multiple predictions, but then you can pick the one that passes this internal check and you return that as the motion plan. Right? Okay, good. So we have done this, and this is these are results on our data set. And what you can see is I'm basically plotting on the x-axis how many solutions you need to try, and on the y-axis, did the motion plan succeed or not, right? And so this is like the complexity of the internal collision checking, internal checks, how many you need to do. And what you can see is that given a fixed budget of number of solutions you want to evaluate or you want to try, you get more successes and you can get them very fast. So even the first few solutions you try end up working out and you can return them. And that's kind of what the neural network was trying to learn and such. We also tried, other obvious baselines. We tried imitation learning, which surprisingly we could not get to work, presumably because it was getting the coarse motion right, but it wasn't able to get the fine, the tolerances. It was beyond the tolerances that we were interested in. Right? Okay, and here are some visualizations of the motion plans that we are able to output, and it you can see these are pretty good motion plans. Right? Okay, good. Maybe I'll pause here for any questions on this part before I move on to the next. Okay, if not, let's keep going. Now, this worked well because we could easily create kinematic simulations for simple one-off objects in real-world scenes, right? If you wanted to do the same thing for more complex objects, that's not quite straightforward because we don't have an easy way of creating these kind of kinematic simulations for more complex objects. And that's kind of what I'll tell you next, which is how can we create kinematic simulations for complex objects and such, right? Yeah, so that brings me to this second part of this talk where I'll describe this. And this is actually a paper at CVPR, which is work led by Shaowei. He's actually around for the conference. If you are interested in chatting with him and in getting into the nitty-gritty things, there's a poster on Thursday afternoon that you can go and visit. But in this CVPR paper, we are basically the target is we are building rearticulable models for arbitrary 3D objects from 4D point clouds. So I have a 4D point cloud that is as input, right? So it's a point cloud that you have recorded a sequence of. And what we want to do is we want to output a rearticulable model, which is we want to identify what are the different parts of this object. We want to identify how these parts are connected to one another and how they are moving with respect to one another, right? So this is, in some sense, if you work with robots and so forth, this is essentially akin to, we want to output a URDF file for this particular object, right? And once you have this, you can actually rearticulate this object in arbitrary ways, right? And you can have a retargeting application that I want to get this. I mean, this could be for reanimation, if you will. We want this point over here, and so forth. And now you can actually solve for the articulation of the different joints, which will get the robot to be in, get this object to be in the pose that you want it to be in. And crucially, we're not trying to do this in a category specific way, but we are going to try to do this in a category agnostic way. So we want to be able to handle arbitrary objects without any category information. So the same model that I like to train, that whatever method I have should be able to work for this robot, but should also be able to work for this sunglasses and so forth. Right? Okay. So that's kind of the problem we are interested in tackling, right? So this thing is motion. This is the 4D point cloud. This is the rearticulable model, part segmentation, skeletal motion, and this is the reanimation, right? We can actually articulate this and regenerate things, right? Okay, good. So that's kind of the problem we are interested in. And specifically in this work, we are focusing on objects which have a collection of 1 degree of freedom joints attached in arbitrary kinematic trees, right? And if you look at everyday objects, which are man-made objects, that's kind of a very dominant mode of articulation in these. You can look at this collection of objects, right? And if you also notice, these have two types of joints. There's revolute joints and there's prismatic joints. And what we would like to do is to tackle, what we're trying to do is to tackle these kind of objects. Okay. There's obviously a lot of past work on this problem. Crucially, I think past work either tackles category specific, builds category specific models. So if you can build specific models for humans and quadrupeds and so forth, or people actually do category agnostic, but they either work with fixed kinematic trees or they do not have realistic joint constraints. Whereas what we are trying to do is we are trying to tackle arbitrary parts and categories with realistic joint constraints and reasonable kinematic structure jointly. Right? Okay, so how do we do this? So we start with the articulable model. So it comes with a kinematic tree that what part is connected to what other part. We need to define some way of identifying what part is in this point cloud. That we do using an implicit function, which takes in the canonical frame of the canonical point cloud. And we essentially learn a function f. It's an implicit part field, which takes in the coordinate of the point and outputs what part it is in, right? So this is our kinematic tree and the canonical segmentation. And then we have essentially articulation parameters. And we represent these using screw parameters, but you could use other things as well, which is essentially defining where is the joint, what is the axis of the joint and where it is located, right? So that's the screw parameterization of the thing. But you also need the state of the screw, which is, how much have I articulated the object, and, if it's a translation joint, then how much I've translated it, right? So that all falls through nicely in this, screw parameterization that past papers have also adopted, and we are also using the same. Okay, so this is kind of the model that I'm trying to estimate. I want to estimate the kinematic tree, I want to estimate the segmentation, and I want to estimate the location of these different joints and their types. Okay, so model that we want to estimate. And we are going to estimate this by analysis by synthesis approach, where we have point clouds which are in different articulation states. We want to find the articulation states for each of these point cloud, for each of these frames that I've been given, such that I will match the point cloud that I'm observing, right? So I'm trying to optimize over these model parameters. So it's like skeleton, like the kinematic structure, the segmentation, the screw parameters, the screw states, such that the articulated point cloud that I'll get after articulation matches the observed point cloud that I've been given at different time steps, right? And we do this, we have a couple of losses here, one which measures the geometry match using chamfer distance and also earth mover distance, and the flow loss, which is how is the part moving and how do I think the part is moving, right? So we have both of these terms which do this. Now, this is nice and good, but the unfortunate thing is we are trying to optimize over weird things. The kinematic tree is a discrete structure, and the continuous and other variables are continuous. This causes problems. You have structured constraints on the parts that can only be a tree and so forth. So it's challenging to optimize this directly. Instead, what we are going to do is we are going to do a relax and project kind of an approach, where we first fit a relaxed model, where we estimate each part motion independently. We do not enforce this constraint that these are 1 degree of freedom objects, or that this part has to move relative to this part, and so forth. We estimate each part moving independently. Once we have some estimates over there, we then project to a valid solution. And a valid solution for us is essentially a kinematic tree where I can link up all these parts such that things still make sense. And then we do a little bit more fine tuning by essentially using the same optimization function, but with like fewer things. We don't change the discrete variables, we only learn the continuous parameters. So that's kind of what we are doing over here, right? So the relaxation is we're not optimizing over the kinematic tree. We are not using screw parameters here. We are actually using free-form transformations denoted by TIs, and we're just optimizing this function. This gives us, the motion of each part and, the part segmentation. Once we get this, we essentially project it down into a valid kinematic tree based articulated model by essentially using, that once I reduce it to a tree, the residuals that I get should be small, right? So that's kind of what we're doing over here. And the fine tuning is just this direct optimization in the final articulated model space that we're interested in. Okay, so this is like a little bit of an animation of how this happens. So we are interested in optimizing this loss function that we have set up under the constraint that the joints are constrained. We can't quite do that. We are not exactly doing that. We are solving a relaxed problem where we essentially reason about 6 of piecewise rigid transformations. We solve this relaxed problem. And then once we have solved this relaxed problem, then we project to the kinematic constraints, and then we fine tune further to actually estimate each of these things. And this actually works quite well. So you can take in a point cloud sequence of the form that you're seeing on the left-hand side. You can actually infer, I'm showing you the inferred part segmentation, the skeleton, the motion, and some reanimation results. So for a complex object, this actually works quite well, right? You can do another robot. I mean, you can have one articulated object, you can have another articulated object, and it kind of does it is able to handle them. The same model is able to handle them. I mean, there's no learning as such. I mean, there's test time optimization. So it's obvious that it can actually handle it. So that works out. We compared to past works which have looked at this problem, and you can see our segmentations are more accurate and our skeletons are more accurate as well. You can have quantitative metrics. I'm not going to go into the details. You can refer to them in the paper. We have thorough sort of ablations where we have tested the different parts of the system, and all of them seem to help and such, right? Okay, so we have actually so some of those results were on synthetic scenes that we had created, but you can actually do this on real world objects as well. So here's an object that you can articulate in different ways. You can record this point cloud video. You can reconstruct it using nice apps that you get on phones these days. And now you can actually pass it into a system, and you can infer the part segmentation, the motion, and you can actually reanimate this object, right? Yeah, so this was about how we can infer complex arrangement of parts and such. I'll pause if people have any comments or questions at this point. Yes, please.
Sure. So is like complete point cloud necessary?
Yeah, that's an excellent point. We in the simulated experiments, we had access to the complete point cloud. In the real world experiments, we don't have access to the full point cloud at all time steps, right? Because as you start moving this thing down, then certain more points become visible. Yes. It kind of works in this setting, but not as well. Like the printer that I showed, right? That has like so many hidden parts. When you open it, then like whole new geometry becomes available. So we have tested it on some real world objects where this is a challenge, but I think yeah, it's a good, excellent point. Yeah. Yes.
This technique, do you have any transfer from having seen similar categories where, I mean, similar kinds of patterns before? Because if you are doing Arbitrary reasoning, and the next time you see another draw, you have to figure it out from fresh.
Yeah. So there's a contrast in the first work. That's what we were doing. We were doing transfer across category. In the second one, it's entirely test time optimization. So there is no priors. There's some training that we do where we are learning the correspondence network across categories, and that generalizes across categories. Like we need to estimate, as I'm moving, I need to estimate correspondences to compute the flow loss and so forth. So that network is being learned, but that transfers, and that's, others have shown that result in the past. For the test time optimization, we are not doing that, and that will be useful because this optimization is a nasty one. And if we had some way of sharing this sharing this optimization over lots of objects, then that will help. Excellent point. Yeah. Okay, I think I might have a little more time that I'll talk about manipulating articulated objects with complex dynamics. So this is some work with Erin Zhang, who is another student in my lab, and this is called learning to look behind plant foliage by moving it. The problem we're interested in, this plant self-occlusion problem. So if you look at plants, plants occlude the space behind them, right? So there is foliage. You are, let's say, trying to find whether your fruit has grown, or you're trying to see if there is some infestation that has happened. You will have to move these leaves aside in order to actually see what is behind the plant, right? So any kind of agriculture application or farming application, this would be a problem that you will be confronted with, right? And that's kind of the problem we are interested in tackling over here, which is we want to be able to articulate the plant, or hopefully not murder the plant, by moving the leaves around. And we want to learn how do leaves move, where can you interact with these leaves, and then actually learn robot policies which can actually do it. So this is some results that we have. I mean, we've the plant has survived all the experimentation we have done. So we have not harmed the plant too much. But what you're seeing here is basically the task is we want to look behind these leaves by moving them. So we are going to, the policy that the robot learns is to actually how to move these leaves around in order to reveal the space that is behind it, right? Now, this is a 3D problem. This is, we want to learn how do leaves and plants articulate and, how do you represent these? I mean, these are all actually very good questions. I think we have just started scratching the surface of this problem. And this is actually quite challenging because, sensing is difficult. You are actually not seeing the full object. You're only seeing a part of an object. There's extreme clutter. There are thin structures like vines and branches and so forth. There's partial observability, right? So any kind of model building that you would want to do, any kind of, let's say, model-based RL you would like to do, you kind of need to build a model. And if you have partial observability, that is kind of difficult, right? So it's an interesting problem. And what we are doing is some data-driven learning methods to directly try to estimate what we want to estimate. Now, if you look at existing work in manipulation, I think there's no good simulator for plants. Please, if there is someone in the room who has a good simulator for plants, please come in. Let me know. I'll be very curious. It will be very useful for us. So there's no, I mean, to the best of our knowledge, no high fidelity simulator for these kind of things. There's unknown dynamics of the plant and the leaves and the branch and so forth, right? So that makes it difficult to use typical model-free RL, model-based RL and such. What we are doing is we are essentially collecting data for this specific task directly in this real world using self-supervision. And that's kind of how we are tackling this. Specifically, what we do is we predict the outcome of input actions. And the task we're interested in is where will space be revealed after executing an action. So we are training models which can take in an image, take in a candidate action, and try to predict where will space be revealed on execution of this action. So here is our setup. We have this robot, this plant inside this robot. We have this camera that is mounted on the top. This is a view you're getting from there. You can see the space that the leaves are occluding, and such, right? This is, this is where we want to reveal the space. This is the action space. The actions that we're working with are essentially, you sample a 3D location XYZ, you sample a direction, and you do a non-prehensile push in that direction. You poke the gripper at that location, you convey it a distance d in a particular direction theta, and that's the action space we're working with. So we are consciously not, touching leaves and flipping them over, partly because we don't know how they will behave, and this is just the first step, and those things would be to follow. Okay, so here is the approach. We have RGB-D images in this case, so RGB image and the height image from the camera. We have some estimate of the space that has been currently revealed. We do cross-entropy method, so it's nothing fancy, which essentially evaluates actions using a neural network that has been learned that given this situation and the action that I'm going to apply, so it's a push in the vertical direction, where will space be revealed if I do this, right? So this is a neural network that we train, and I'll tell you more about that in a bit. This predicts some space, and what CM does is it takes a union of the new space that will be revealed and the old space that has been revealed already, and tries to compute the best action based on how much new space will be revealed, right? And then it searches over some number of actions and then spits out the action that will reveal that reveals the most space. Now, note over here, we need to characterize where all space will get revealed, not just how much space is revealed. Because if you just output a scalar, which is how much space is revealed, that is not useful in terms of chaining actions together to have this long-term behavior. That's why in this model, we are trying to predict where exactly revealed rather than total how much space is being revealed, which is what past work with self-supervision would do, where they would just predict like the grasping outcome and such, right? Okay, so this happens, you figure out the best action, you execute that action, you recompute what space got revealed, and then you keep doing this over and over again. Okay, so at the heart of this is this neural network that has been learned to predict what space will be revealed. So we have this, as I said, RGB and height images. We pass them through an encoder-decoder network. We represent the action using, where it was executed and in what direction was it executed. All of that gets passed into this encoder-decoder network. It has skip connections and so forth, and it predicts probability of revealing space, right? So these are space revealed prediction network. Could not come up with a better name. Yeah, as I said, we collected data in a self-supervised way. We just try different actions. We compute the outcome of this action, and we compute how much space got revealed and just collect a data set. In this case, it was some 2,200 interactions collected over 18 hours. So that's what we have. And now we can start playing with this model and seeing what it does. So the goal is maximize the cumulative space revealed over a 10 time step episode. And the metric is space revealed in number of pixels in this case. And we compare again some interesting baselines. So the first baseline is a tiling baseline, where you essentially, the students sat down and designed that these are actions which are most likely to reveal the most space. So these are like tangential to the leaves and so forth. And you have to sample 10 of them, and you sample them such that they are all spread apart. So that's kind of how you sample these actions. So that's one baseline. There's another baseline, which is you can not use this learned dynamics model, but you can actually work with a handcrafted dynamics model, right? So instead of using SRPNet in this CM input to CM, we actually use a handcrafted dynamics model, which is actually just the simple dynamics that as you move the gripper, these are radial leaves which will get revealed and such, right? So that's a handcrafted dynamics model. And then you can actually, there's another baseline, which is you can replace it with a model which does not receive any visual input and so forth. So these are the different methods we compared. You can see, here is a plot which is showing how much space got revealed as a function of number of time steps. And you can see that we are revealing the most number of pixels as opposed to these baseline methods. We have a very high camera, so you have pixels which are 64,000. And over the most competitive baseline by a very large amount. And this essentially suggests that you need learning to model behavior of these kind of complex objects. Just handcrafting, just thinking that, oh, it's a simple model of this form actually doesn't work. Is able to leverage the visual observations. It's not just coming from, the improvements are not just coming from keeping track of what space got revealed where, but also looking at the image and making predictions that, okay, are more effective than other actions and such, right? So it can use the visual information well. We can do other things with this. You can actually do targeted reveal, which is, I want to look behind this particular leaf, right? And again, we are comparing against these same baseline methods. We see we are able to look behind a specific described leaf quite effectively, right? So getting an improvement here as well. We have done actually all of this for another plant. So in this case, these are synthetic vines, where we essentially have different configurations of these vines, and we've repeated this experiment in this setting as well, and we get improvements in this as well. Okay, so to summarize, I think what I showed you today was 3 different aspects of dealing with articulated objects around us. The first was, how can you output motion plans, or like precise motion plans for articulating 1 degree of freedom objects in varied scene geometries. Second was, how can we infer rearticulable models for articulated objects through point cloud observations. And the last one was, how can we manipulate articulated objects which have complex dynamics? There are many things that I like to discuss. I think what Georgia was also saying, like when we have output 3D geometry in some way for us, will be actually errors. And how can you design control strategies which are robust to these 3D estimation errors? I think that's something that we should be thinking about. We should be thinking about how can we scale up 3D articulated models through RGB video observations as opposed to point cloud observations that I described today. And the last one I like to bring up is, how can we build 3D representations for plants, right? I mean, should I do voxels? Should I do implicit surfaces? I mean, these things deform. What is the right way of thinking about them is something to think about. And with that, I'd like to thank you all for your attention and acknowledge the students who did all the amazing work. Thank you. Yes, yes.
So actually, I'm curious about second. You just mentioned that you have this correspondence model and then you do test combination. So how exactly is this correspondence model trained?
This correspondence model is trained on lots of ShapeNet-like objects, or like simulated objects, where you articulate them in different ways, and then you compute, because these are simulated, you know what the ground truth correspondence is, and we train with some Siamese laws.
The ShapeNet objects are not articulated.
Oh yeah, so PartNet, sorry, PartNet and the like, yeah. And I think one important detail to notice is you resample the mesh when you render, when you do different time steps. If you don't resample the mesh, then it actually overfits on the local geometry, right? So yeah, and by the way, the code for the first two projects is already available online. The data set that we collected for the first data project is already, you can actually look at it on my website. And yeah, so those details are available. Yes. Yeah. So right now we are thinking of in a task agnostic manner that we want to reveal as much space as possible. Of course, this should be done in context of applications that you are trying to find like a specific thing, or you're trying to investigate specific parts of the plant. We're not doing that partly because, then it'll become task specific, even more task specific. So right now it's more general. You can use for any kind of task, which involves reasoning about space. Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
Do you assume these film to be back to the original shape after you manipulate it?
We don't. When we are doing CEM, we are actually doing action rollouts with a horizon of 1. So it doesn't require that assumption. If you look, that is largely true for like these big leaf kind of plants. It's largely true. It's not exactly true, of course. With like more like wine-like things, I think it's less true. I think you might see that, okay, you did some interaction, then it doesn't come back to its original state. And that's again a complexity, right? Like when we are trying to compute the self-supervision for this plant case, you have to be quite careful in terms of how do you measure where you saw space, because you could just be moving the entire plant, right? And yes, that will reveal space, but that's not revealing space inside the plant. So we do some ICP actually to align it and then compute the revealed space. Good question. Yeah. Yes.
Thanks for the talk. And for the third part, I'm wondering if you plan to include more complex actions apart from approach.
Yeah.
I'm also curious about whether more complex actions would actually destroy your plans.
Yeah, that's a very good question. So we are right now not dealing with, we have some sort of a threshold. If the robot experiences very large torques, then stop that action. But more complex action will actually be better. I think, in fact, for the vines, we started with actually the vines, and a much simpler action space works for that. The same simple action space actually doesn't work with this Dracaena plant. We had to make it like a 3D action space. So I think that is, I think the reason why we did not do a more expressive action space is it includes, it further enlarges the sample complexity of learning, right? That now you have to reason about 6 off trajectories of the gripper, which is harder. But we are trying to do that. I think, yeah.